Squad, welcome back, and if you're new, welcome to the channel. A nearly universal feature of fantastic or magical settings is the presence of enchanted objects, from haunted fells and sinister woods to talking swords and malicious jewelry. At times, these artifacts are the product of an outside magical force, some spell or curse or necromantic tomfoolery. In other instances, though, the setting itself seems in some way alive. There are many purely literary reasons an author, even one not writing a work of fantasy, might describe inanimate objects by ascribing personal attributes or emotions to them. Techniques like personification can evoke powerful imagery, set a mood or a tone, or reveal a character's state of mind. In Tolkien's particular case, these descriptions have an additional purpose, helping convey the perspective of his characters, who are generally much more open to the possibility that the world they live in has a mind of its own. However, there are several cases in Middle-earth in which the apparent agency of landmarks and objects seems to warrant a more literal interpretation. Woods and forests are frequently described as either welcoming or hostile in themselves. But beyond this, we know that individual trees in Middle-earth frequently pursue their own agendas, with far greater directness and mobility than you might expect. The Willow Man of the Old Forest in Buckland physically attacks the hobbits, and the tree-ish denizens of Fangorn play an important part in defeating the armies of Saruman at the Hornburg. It's not just trees, though. While Boromir suspects that Sauron's influence may be responsible for the sudden blizzard on the slopes of Caradhras, other characters are inclined to blame the mountain itself. Caradhras was called the Cruel and had an ill name, said Gimli, long years ago, when rumor of Sauron had not been heard in these lands. The apparent willfulness of the Rings of Power, especially the ruling ring, is a critical part of the story. In the first age, Turin's sword Gurthang not only seems to grieve the death of Beleg, it also apparently speaks to Turin, declaring its willingness to take his life. Even the Silmarils seem to show certain preferences and opinions, including who they will suffer to handle them. While each of these examples includes a greater or lesser degree of ambiguity, it's not easy to write any of them off as a simple case of poetic exaggeration or misinterpretation by the characters. Huorns and other animated trees are probably the most explicit and unambiguous examples of the natural world displaying unusual agency. Treebeard describes it thusly. Most of the trees are just trees, of course, but many are half awake. Some are quite wide awake, and a few are, getting entish. Some of my trees are limb-lithe, and many can talk to me. This is also perhaps the least jarring case. While sometimes overlooked as mere scenery, plants and trees are undeniably living things, engaged in the same struggle for survival as other organisms. They affect and respond to their surroundings, so it's not much of a stretch to conceive of them as having a sort of diffuse, slow-acting will of their own, even in primary reality. On the slopes of cruel Caradhras, the Fellowship encounters such appalling conditions that they cannot reach the Redhorn Gate as planned, and must instead pass under the mountain through the orc and Balrog-infested mine of Moria. While it's true that weather conditions on high mountain passes are often extreme and volatile, it's not just the naive hobbits who suspect something uncanny is going on. Aragorn is surprised to see such conditions early in the winter season and at such relatively low elevation. Gimli is disgruntled by snowdrifts that seem intentionally positioned to cut off the Fellowship's escape. And once the party has descended, the storm breaks up as abruptly as it appeared, as if Caradhras was satisfied that the invaders had been beaten off and would not dare to return. Gandalf characterizes the storm as an attack. There are several possible explanations for this. Boromir wonders if this is a contrivance of the enemy. They say in Myland that he can govern the storms in the Mountains of Shadow that stand upon the borders of Mordor. He has strange powers and many allies. Aragorn admits the storm does seem unnatural, but is less sure of its origins. There are many evil and unfriendly things in the world that have little love for those that go on two legs, and yet are not in league with Sauron but have purposes of their own. Some have been in this world longer than he. The ruling ring itself is a particularly sinister and pronounced case of an apparently lifeless object possessing desires and wills of its own. In the account of Isildur's death published in Unfinished Tales, Tolkien describes the ring as still heavy with Sauron's evil will, and seeking all means to return to its lord, as it did again when he recovered and was rehoused. Gandalf explains to Frodo that a ring of power looks after itself. It was not Gollum, Frodo, but the ring itself that decided things. The ring left him. This is a central issue in The Lord of the Rings, whose whole plot hinges on the ring being treacherous to wield and hazardous even to possess. In evaluating this property of the ring, I've previously argued that what appears to be willfulness may just be a simple way of describing the ring's tendencies, themselves the product of its creation. The ring is an expression of Sauron's power, which at this point would have been 99.9% dedicated to domination, control, force, and other unsavory undertakings. Even more importantly, the ring was designed by Sauron to function in service of these goals. However, there is an additional wrinkle to this idea, which lies in Tolkien's repeated assertions that by externalizing their individual power, people inherently sacrifice control over it. If I were to philosophize this myth, I should say it was a mythical way of representing the truth that potency, or perhaps rather potentiality, if it is to be exercised and produce results, has to be externalized and so, as it were, passes to a greater or less degree out of one's direct control. Thus, the ring seems to wield a certain influence over even its maker. So great was the ring's power of lust that anyone who used it became mastered by it. It was beyond the strength of any will, even Sauron's own, to injure it, cast it away, or neglect it. So while the ring may not be a fully individuated character, describing it as merely an extension of Sauron's will doesn't do justice to the importance of this concept, one of the few consistently applied magical principles that Tolkien elaborated on. Accepting this possibility in the case of the ring helps illuminate other cases of created items that seem to have preferences, goals, and wills of their own. The black sword Gurthang, originally named Anglachel, is similar to the ring in many respects. Forged by notoriously cranky elvinsmith Eöl, who offered it to Thingol with the same enthusiasm that most of us feel when paying property taxes, the sword is powerful but treacherous. Even Melian the Maya, who is renowned for her wisdom, cautions Beleg against it. There is malice in this sword, the dark heart of the smith still dwells in it. It will not love the hand it serves, neither will it abide with you long. Sure enough, even if the sword wasn't literally cursed, it might as well have been, leading to Beleg's death when it wakes the unconscious Turin with an ill-timed slice. The blade then passes to Turin himself, a man whose name is synonymous with bad luck, bad timing, and bad judgment. With all the doom already going on in his life, for a few years it's hard to tell whether the ill-favored sword even continues to affect its bearer. Gurthang's final speech to Turin is also somewhat historically suspect. Leaving aside for the moment the degree of Turin's trauma as he contemplates taking his own life, which was surely more than sufficient to result in a psychotic break, he addresses his sword after having far outrun the elves of Doriath pursuing him, and falls upon it before they can reach him. It's not impossible that Mablung and company indeed heard the blade speak as they tried to catch up to Turin, and maybe one of them brought news of it to the bards who later compiled the legend of Turin in its fullest form. But it also smacks of poetic embellishment, the kind of thing invented to add more drama to a climactic death scene that, in reality, may have had no surviving witnesses. Harder to explain is the blade's apparent mourning for Beleg. After its first master's death, Anglachel loses its luster and goes dull and blunt, to such a degree that the smiths of Nargothrond are obliged to reforge and rename it. It's hard to imagine an elven blade forged of meteoric iron undergoing such a sudden and pronounced transformation without some kind of supernatural power at play. Even Gwyndor observes that this is not expected behavior from a weapon. This is a strange blade, and unlike any that I have seen in Middle-earth. It mourns for Beleg even as you do. A less ominous but still perilous example is the Silmarils. The Silmarils have enough curses, dooms, prophecies, and benedictions acting on them already to make them highly significant. But on top of that, they also seem alive in some way. Even in the darkness of the deepest treasury, the Silmarils of their own radiance shone like the stars of Varda. And yet, as were they indeed living things, they rejoiced in light and received it and gave it back in hues more marvelous than before. When Beren plucks one from the Iron Crown, it does not burn his mortal flesh. Instead, the Silmarillion says the jewel suffered his touch and hurt him not. It is decidedly less forgiving when it comes to the demonic wolf Carcharoth. Its two companions later reject the flesh of their maker's surviving sons as unclean. In cases like the Ring, Gorthang, and the Silmarils, we appear to be seeing objects imbued with particular tendencies by their creators. These objects exemplify something like independent consciousness or will, as a result of their creator's necessary surrender of control over them. This also gives us some idea of how and why the natural world functions as an active participant in the unfolding of Middle-earth's history. The shape and substance of Arda was conceived before the dawn of time by the Ainur in their great music. If the same principles of creation that govern works of craft also apply to the creation of the world, we can think of the elements of Arda as the embodiment of the Ainur's minds and wills, made separate and independent from them as they attained true being. On top of this, the creation of Arda was a collaborative act. While each of the Ainur who participated in this act of creation had their own special areas of concern, they also affected and were affected by the songs of others, often in unexpected ways. And while the Ainur imagined the different elements and patterns of Arda, it was Eru Iluvatar who not only inspired their song but then spoke it into existence, and he remains able to intervene from outside of Arda at any point. Finally, both during the Ainulindale and afterward within Arda, Melkor and his servants wove a corrupting tendency into the world itself, giving everything in the world some capacity, and sometimes even a proclivity, for malice and evil. So even the apparently passive substances and predetermined conditions of Middle-earth itself are not always entirely predictable. Not only do they have a degree of independence as a consequence of their very existence, but they are each an expression of multiple wills, and the ongoing interaction between them creates infinite new combinations and reactions. This gives us some idea for why some objects and elements in Middle-earth truly display a certain quality, call it will, preference, tendency, or intent, that approaches an outright personality. However, it still doesn't seem quite right to treat things like the Ring or Caradhras as characters, certainly not characters in the traditional sense. While they do seem capable of independent reactions that can shape the course of history, they do not appear subject to the same kind of morality that men, elves, dwarves, and Ainur do. Again, in most fantastical settings, inanimate objects possessing human levels of will or intelligence can be accepted without comment. But Tolkien's ideas about the interaction of fate and free will, ideas that lie at the very heart of The Lord of the Rings, generally describe true agency and the ability to make truly moral decisions as relatively rare commodities. In an examination of the Elvish words for fate and destiny, Tolkien describes truly free will as a uniquely personal attribute. Although many complex motions and physical interactions create ever-changing conditions in Arda, until the appearance of will, all is mere preparation, interesting only on a quite different and lower plane, like mathematics, or observing the physical events of the world, or in a similar way, the workings of a machine. Will first appeared with the Ainur or Valar. Thus, the interacting tendencies of inanimate objects, partly determined by the wills of their creators but no longer subject to their control, can act independently to affect the plot of Arda's history. However, they lack the freedom and so-called true will to make truly moral choices. While they can and do act in ways both hostile and helpful, their actions can't be characterized as good or evil. Once more, animated trees provide the closest example to something like a human experience of consciousness. Tree-ish and mannish aims, to live long, avoid injury and blight, enjoy a territory with plentiful resources, and produce successful offspring, are not so different, and it's not hard to see why the awakened trees of Fangorn would seize the opportunity to eliminate the common threat of Saruman's destructive armies while remaining neutral, for now, to the more circumspect men of Rohan. Treebeard, who does seem to be more a person than a tree, nevertheless gives a good explanation of the tree-ish position. I have not troubled about the Great Wars, they mostly concern elves and men. I am not altogether on anybody's side, because nobody is altogether on my side, if you understand me. Nobody cares for the woods as I care for them, not even elves nowadays. In the Silmarillion, we learn the Misty Mountains, the range that includes the Peak of Caradhras, were reared by Melkor to hinder the riding of Orome. So not only are they particularly infused with the lingering will of Morgoth, they were also designed to slow or prevent passage over them. As an ancestral home of the dwarves, Caradhras has been the site of excavations for millennia, a process one of my patrons compared to having one's guts slowly carved out. As the demand for mithril increased, this mining intensified in the Third Age, which also roused the Balrog dwelling in its depths, something likely akin to a bad case of evil heartburn. On top of the possible effects of Sauron's will, proximity to his ring, and the lingering dregs of Morgoth's power, it's not hard to imagine the mountain itself, like the trees of the Old Forest and Fangorn, reacting defensively to the approach of any strangers, regardless of their alignment. While malicious, sinister, and dangerous, the blade Gorthang doesn't appear to be wholly evil. It's said to rejoice at being unsheathed against Morgoth's orcs. It both leads to the death of Beleg and mourns for him. It's eager to slay Turin, but this is partly because it resents being used to kill Beleg and Brandir, whom it characterizes as slain unjustly. And lest we forget, it serves Turin well for many years against the servants of Morgoth, including in the slaying of Glaurung, a mighty deed that's justly renowned. The Silmarils are a more beautiful but still ambivalent example. They were created during the high point of the bliss of Aman by the compulsively creative Feanor, the greatest craftsman of the elves. While Feanor's character devolves into madness after he creates his masterwork, he's not described as being evil from the beginning, and the Valar themselves acclaim the creation of the Silmarils as a tremendous feat. All who dwelt in Aman were filled with wonder and delight at the work of Feanor. Despite the violence and bloodshed they inspire, they do seem to have some positive powers. It's the holy light of a Silmaril that Eärendil bears aloft in his celestial voyages, as a sign of hope to the dwellers of Middle-earth. This same light, gathered into a phial by Galadriel, protects Frodo and Sam from Shelob. But at the same time, their beauty repeatedly leads characters into jealousy, recklessness, and paranoia, from Feanor and his sons to Thingol to Morgoth himself. While the Silmaril of Beren scorches the flesh of Carcharoth, it also gives him unprecedented power, allowing him to cross even the impenetrable girdle of Melian. Even the ruling ring, a product of near-total evil whose functions seem restricted to temptation, corruption, and domination, sometimes works against its master. Those who fall under the sway of the ring go to great lengths to protect and hide it with meticulous care, which makes it all the more challenging for Sauron and his agents to find the darn thing. Gollum's obsession with the ring gives him the fortitude to defy Sauron and resist his efforts to regain it, something he would otherwise likely be incapable of. It also drives Gollum to attack Frodo at the Cracks of Doom, contributing to the circumstances necessary for his providential fall into the fire, bringing about the ring's destruction. The apparent personalities of entities like Caradhras and Gorthang are much more than mere ornamentation, giving Tolkien stories a little exotic flair. Their unusual powers hinted a world that, like our own, is too vast and complex to be fully explained by any one perspective. Tolkien himself, as well as his characters, affirm that the moral struggle between good and evil was central to Middle-earth. However, Tolkien also expressed impatience with others' reductive interpretations of this struggle. Reacting to a radio program that had described Old Man Willow as an ally of Mordor, he wrote, "Cannot people imagine things hostile to men and hobbits who prey on them without being in league with the devil?" In another letter regarding, of all things, Tom Bombadil, he said, "You must concentrate on some part, probably relatively small, of the world universe, whether to tell a tale, however long, or to learn anything, however fundamental, and therefore much will, from that point of view, be left out, distorted on the circumference, or seen a discordant oddity." These ideas reveal something about the role of some of the inhuman forces that affect the narrative. Though their concerns are largely outside the realm of good and evil, as experienced by rational creatures, they nonetheless contribute to the great tale of Arda. The choices faced by Middle-earth's people can be difficult to discern, but they are also undeniably moral decisions. Yet even in cases where the right course of action is clear, there remains doubt about its outcome. The wisest and best intended plans sometimes end in utter tragedy, while the failings and flaws of struggling individuals can be turned to eucatastrophe. One of the factors that makes this possible is the existence of objects, forces, and beings that, while impersonal, are still actively pursuing agendas that cannot be neatly explained by the all-encompassing moral conflicts at the heart of the characters' experiences. The slow wrath of a forest could prove as hostile to orcs as it is to hobbits. An evil ring might end up working toward the dissolution of its own power. And sometimes even the shiniest of jewels forebode death and darkness to those who look upon their light. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button to see if its innate tendencies exert any independent influence on the great algorithm. Subscribe to see more videos like this, and if you're interested in bonus content, behind-the-scenes peeks, or just hanging out in Discord, you can check out my Patreon page linked in the description. Thanks to everyone for watching, and special thanks to my patrons, including John H. Austin Jr., Gandalf the Grey, Marcel Ribeiro, Nick Rialo, Jeremy Buckingham, Bitso Bongo, Kevin Gilstat, Dorwin Gray, Brendan Mooney, E. Rose B., Allison Kreutzberg, Frankie 12-String, Luke, Joel Bion, Rogue Hot Pocket, and Jared Carver. Until next time, stay safe and be well.